Hello YouTube. Franz Josef Land is an archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. The archipelago is in the north of the Barents Sea. It's part of the Arkhangelsk region of Russia and consists of 192 islands. Small, large and medium-sized islands covered with huge eternal glaciers from which bluish blocks of icebergs break off with a roar, with extinct ancient volcanoes where deep snow now lies, with rocky narrow beaches where herds of walruses roar between driftwood logs thrown up by the ocean, and mysteries ancient and recent. All this is Franz Josef Land. The islands are scattered over several hundred kilometers of the Barents Sea, the northernmost archipelago of the planet. There's no time in this territory. It always seems to be a wide, endless day there. The sun does not set below the horizon. It moves slowly around the celestial circle. The German Schatzgraber, treasure hunter in English, military base on Alexandra Land, one of the main islands of the Franz Josef Land archipelago, was discovered after the end of World War II. It still has not revealed all its secrets to Russian researchers. For example, where did an old document come from, ancient document, which could have somehow, it's very hardly that it would have ended accidentally in a soldier's pocket. The camp with the meteorological complex did not last long in the Arctic, only 9 months. Maybe the Germans would have stayed longer, but they began to eat the meat of polar bears, which were more numerous in the archipelago than people, and fell ill with trichinosis. Why was it necessary to eat bear meat is an open question, because there was more than enough food in the camp. For example, sardine cans and schnapps bottles were found there. The situation turned out to be so critical that the Nazis were urgently evacuated by air. In a hurry, they abandoned all their equipment and weapons, but they couldn't take everything away at once. Their cache has not been discovered yet. We gotta keep it in mind. One of the most experienced members of the Russian research for the area, Captain Rostislav Gaidovsky, said that in a good weather he flew around Alexandra's Land and the dome of the Melechov Glacier, and he saw a rectangular spot on the glacier. He suspected that these were the things that were left behind. There was also a hypothesis that the Germans had dropped something at the bottom of the lake. But lakes in the Arctic disappear as quickly as they appear, according to Sergei Goncharov, member of the Murmansk regional branch of the Russian Geographical Society. We're dealing with a historical detective story, and maybe more than that. I told you, the Arctic has its mysteries. I will present the information available, but I choose not to do it in chronological order. You will, however, get the full picture of the materials I have gathered. But again, we don't know what's at the bottom of the lake, we don't know what's hidden in the snow, we don't even know exact mission of the people that were sent from Nazi Germany to that Russian island. But at least we'll know what is out in the open sources. In the year 2023, the participants of the Russian Geographical Society expedition found a unique document, or rather a fragment of it, several fused pages of an ancient book. Which one still remains to be found out. Scientists say that this is a true historical detective story. The text was created in Gothic script. There were different hypotheses what it was, right down to the Bible. The Russians contacted the German Language Society in Wiesbaden through their specialists. The professors struggled with the paper and found out that it was an old text from the 17th century. The book was a rarity during the war, and it is not known how it got into the pocket of a Nazi, assuming intelligence officer stationed in the Arctic. For comparison, it is as if a Soviet soldier had a manuscript of words about Igor's regiment, written in Old Slavonic script, explained Sergei Goncharov. The pages were carefully preserved and dried, but they could not be separated from each other without special equipment and chemicals, as the risk of damaging fragile sheets that had lain in the ground for almost 80 years was very high. Therefore, they were handed over to the criminologists of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Murmansk region of the Russian Federation, in order for the researchers to continue further work on the study of the historical find. It took more than 2 months of painstaking work for Police Captain Daria Simakova, a criminologist at the Crime Expertise Service of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia in the Murmansk region. According to Irina Volk, an official representative of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia. By the way, this Major General, Irina Volk, of the Russian police, will be advancing along the career ladder of the Russian politics, and we may see her in the Kremlin one day soon at the top. I did a video about her a few years ago. Keep your eyes on her. Let's get back to the Arctic. The Russian expert worked with the document very carefully. She cautiously straightened it out, tried to separate the sheets from each other without loss. The paper was then placed in a glycerin solution to stop the destruction and preserve the printed marks in their original form. The dirt thoroughly hid the text, so the soil, remnants of Arctic plants, and even shellfish were carefully removed from the document and washed with distilled water. Daria Simakova carefully selected which substances and in what proportions she could use them so as not to lose the artifact. The document was revealed millimeter by millimeter. Not all the sheets were saved and not all were separated because they couldn't know how long the sheets had been in this state, how much the fibers were interlocked with each other, according to Daria Simakova, speaking about the difficult job she had. Some of the letters were already almost invisible, but criminologists know how to make the secret obvious. A video spectral comparator came to the rescue. The ancient document was restored as far as possible with all modern devices and handed over to scientists for further study. And now it will be them who will be, and they are, struggling to find out the secret of how such a rare book ended up on the Alexandra's land. So far, the main hypothesis is that it was used as an encryption key. It's hard to imagine that any of the officers would be interested in such reading, and even in the Arctic. We talked with experts in the field of encryption, and they confirmed that such a book could be used as a key. The word order and phrase structure in it are very different from modern German, added Sergei Goncharov. By the way, Murmansk criminologists at the Ministry of Internal Affairs do not rarely work with documents from the time of World War II. As the head of the Crime Expertise Service of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia in the Murmansk region, Police Colonel Maxim Yershov told local reporters, for example, they receive from the participants in Russian search organizations remains of Red Army soldiers and documents found with them. After more than 80 years, many are difficult to read, but they are the only chance to find out the Soviet combatant's name and to find his family to let him know. So let's move on to the year 2016, to the interview in Russian media. So at least you get a better idea about the territory where the book was found. Several journalists talked with Evgeny Yermolov, a researcher at the Russian Arctic National Park, who conducted research on Alexandra's Land. From him they learned that what scientists have discovered in the northernmost territory of Russia. Actually, the word discover shouldn't apply here, but media carelessly uses it, and I'll explain. Anyway, it was a small German weather station during the Second World War, or Hitler's secret, previously unknown base in the Arctic, as the media would refer to it. Weather station treasure hunter, Schatzgraber in German. That's what the Germans themselves called that facility, which operated on the island of Alexandra's Land from September 1943 to July 1944. During this mission, more than 700 weather reports were transmitted from the weather station, according to Evgeny Yermolov. The station was called secret because during the World War II, its existence in the USSR was unknown. The abandoned station was accidentally discovered back in 1947. That's when it was discovered by the Soviets. But there's more to this story. Since 1952, Soviet polar explorers have lived there, awaiting the opening of a new weather station. And already in 1956, all buildings were burned down. The reason? Apparently somebody wanted to keep Nazi presence in the Soviet Arctic during that short period of World War II secret. Well, and how secret is the station today? You need to understand that people live on Alexandra's Land on a permanent basis. Polar explorers, military, and we'll get into this later, border guards. And almost all the inhabitants of the island know about the location of the German weather station. It is only 7 kilometers from the current border post. You can get to it on foot. Previously, polar or Arctic researchers had already compiled a description of the weather station itself, and Yermolov personally conducted an initial collection of preserved artifacts back in 2012. Back then, they conducted a reconnaissance of the area, mainly that, but in 2016 they started a detailed study. The station itself is a shield house, from which has several living rooms and a power plant. There were also several tents with provisions and other supplies. The Germans usually placed a network of defensive structures around the station, minefields, shelters for riflemen, soldiers, built of stone. In addition, the Germans were able to build a bunker along which housed the MG-34 machine gun. The Germans also set up reserve bases at several points on the island with tents, supplies, and radio stations. And as for the information about the equally secret airfield, there was no airfield as such. There was a temporary runway on which at least once a large 4-engine reconnaissance aircraft U-200 landed. Supplies to the weather station were dropped from the aircraft, who were flying without landing. The German Arctic explorers themselves were transported to Franz Josef Land by a small transport converted from a fishing trawler, accompanied by only one submarine. Everything was very modest. What was actually discovered at the weather station? The value of the work that they carried out that year, 2016, lies in the fact that a topographic plan of this object was drawn up. Its components were described and objects were collected that accurately tell us that this is a German weather station. Russian researchers brought various documents to Arkhangelsk, which were well preserved in Arctic conditions, various packages of food and hygiene supplies. For example, Nivea toothpaste, remnants of shoes, bags with Wehrmacht stamps, and even German mines, Sprengmine 35. There are about 600 items in total. The work is not finished yet. There is still material that very valuable to historians. And of course, we assume that some of this material is really secretive and no scientists, civilian scientists, will get their hands on it. In addition, the researchers will have to study in more detail the very activities of the Germans in the archipelago. To do this, you need to consult the German archives. In reality, all 10 German Arctic explorers working at the stations were evacuated. Not one of them on that island died, although they all got sick after eating Arctic bear meat. In 2016, the remains of the secret German weather station Schatzgraber were delivered to the Museum of the Russian Arctic National Park in Arkhangelsk. The weather station was only part of the Arctic project of the Third Reich. The flight of the Graf Zeppelin is known. The Nazis organized expeditions to different parts of the world in order to conduct scientific research. But mostly these were archaeological expeditions, the task of which was to search for occult artifacts and evidence of the selected Aryan race. And you can find a number of videos on this subject in my channel. There are also theories about the Arctic claiming that Hitler allegedly planned to find there almost the Holy Grail itself, or secret passages to the center of the Earth, so it would be easier to seize power over the entire world. But most likely the Nazis' goals in the Arctic were much more realistic. Even before the outbreak of World War II, the German military command began making plans for the Northern Sea route. In particular, if the Germans had been able to control this territory, military and merchant ships would have cruised through it without interference. Let us look closer. In 1931, when relations between the USSR and Germany were good, the famous aeronaut and airship designer Hugo Eckener, together with a group of German researchers, took part in an international Arctic expedition. The Graf Zeppelin airship, with a team of Soviet and German scientists on board, headed from Leningrad across the Barents Sea to Franz Josef Land, and from there to Severnaya Zemlya, flew over Taimyr and Novaya Zemlya, and returned safely to Berlin. Soviet leadership, without hesitation, gave the go-ahead for this flight, since the Arctic lands at that time represented a completely unexplored empty space. The other information, now well known in Russia, is that the German base in this area appeared because in 1940, Soviet icebreakers escorted German raiders to the Northern Sea route, who then attacked British ships in the Pacific Ocean. The German navigators carefully documented the fairways shown to them during the passage. Using this data, the submariners brought a small number of weather station personnel to Alexandra Land in 1943. And as you know, by that time, the USSR was invaded by Nazi Germany and was fighting them. Its data, transmitted by radio to Berlin, made it possible to accurately predict the weather, which is important when planning Air Force combat operations. But in 1939, the German General Staff, and in particular the commander of the German submarine fleet, Admiral Karl Dönitz, used the results of the 1931 report on on the scientific expedition that I mentioned, to draw up plans for military operations in the northern seas. It was at the initiative of Dönitz that the construction of special submarines designed for combat operations in the Arctic began. In this regard, it was decided to arrange bases for German submarines in the Arctic. Although formally it was Soviet territory, the border in these uninhabited places was it was not guarded. The construction of the structures was carried out directly on the ice in permafrost conditions. Everything necessary was delivered by submarines. In March of 1941, a German Do-215 aircraft was spotted by Soviet Arctic aviation over the island of Alexandra Land. And in the summer of 1942, Soviet pilots managed to locate an unknown radio station in these places. They also noticed that someone was sending signals with rockets from the island. In addition, some structures covered with metal mesh were visible from the air on the island. However, the Soviet command at that time did not have the resources to figure out what was happening in these desolate lands. It was necessary to solve more important military tasks. With the outbreak of the war, the Germans were faced with the problems of obtaining meteorological data, especially in the Arctic. The weather data was important because for the adversary it has become extremely valuable resource, especially during Navy and aviation operations. Anyway, they needed to know what was going on. Therefore, the Germans were beginning to hastily deploy a network of meteorological stations in the polar regions. The settlement in Svalbard, for example, that's Norway, they were not directly affected or impacted by Germany's invasion of Norway on April 9, 1940, the fighting that ensued, or the capitulation. After the Norwegian government and the royal family fled to London in 1940, operation in Svalbard continued as they had when the war started. This changed after Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. In August-September 1941, Allied forces evacuated everyone from Svalbard. And all Soviet citizens were sent to Arkhangelsk on the cruise ship Empress of Canada, which then was returned to transport all Norwegian citizens to Great Britain. All coal that had been already mined was set on fire, so it would not benefit the Germans. The Germans soon realized that everyone had been evacuated from Svalbard by September 1941, and they established their first weather station Banzo and a winter airstrip in Adventdalen, just outside of Longyearbyen. So, information would be received on the Norwegian Svalbard from submarines and aircraft. Periodically, detachments of meteorologists who corrected the operation of the fleet and aviation with their data. Also, automatic probes with the same goals were actively dropped from aircraft. I wanted to let you know this so you understand how important the Arctic region was for Nazi Germany, and that we still don't know everything about their plans, real plans, and activities. But the new link in the network of meteorological stations was to be that station on the Alexandra Land, one of the islands of the Franz Josef archipelago in the Barents Sea. The location of the weather station was associated with the implementation of the Operation Wonderland, which set as its goal the destruction of the northern convoys. Also, the Nazis planned to deploy a small base for submarines and their refueling. For these purposes, it was necessary to build a small fuel and lubricant warehouse. So, as I said, in the year 2016, the expedition of employees of the Russian Arctic National Park discovered a huge number of kerosene tanks at the station site. Preparations for the deployment of the weather station went thoroughly. Back in the 1930s, aerial photography of the region was made, and we already know how. Meteorological scientists who were supposed to be the crew of the station trained in the Alps, getting used to the harsh Arctic conditions. So, in August of 1943, an inconspicuous fishing trawler, gently swaying on the waves, stubbornly sailed to Alexandra's Land. In appearance, the ship was completely peaceful. Few people knew that the trawler was accompanied by a German submarine, and on board were not ordinary fishermen, but meteorologists and military personnel of Nazi Germany, most likely intelligence operatives too. And obviously they carried with them that ancient, mysterious book. Finally, the ship approached the long-awaited goal, going deep into the North Bay. A detachment of 10 men landed on the coast and hastily proceeded to unload. However, there was no particular reason to fear. Alexandra's Land was completely uninhabited. Only 150 kilometers from the island was the Soviet weather station Tikhaya Bay. That's where it operated, but that's it. So 8 meteorologists and 2 German officers settled on the island and began construction of the station, which received that name Schatzgraber, treasure hunter. The construction of the station did not take much time. The German detachment was perfectly equipped, and the equipment was the most modern for its time. Very interesting for a remote weather station in godforsaken Arctic. Food alone was brought enough to last for 2 years. Of course, the Nazis, they did not forget about the weapons. The station's combat arsenal included the MG-34 machine gun I mentioned earlier, Mauser 98 rifles, M24 hand grenades, and Sprengmine 35 mines. Soon, the weather station, prudently surrounded by a network of minefields, began to operate. Sometime later, the Nazis even arranged a temporary airfield. Observations were made every hour, and in all, from 1943 to 1944, the weather station transmitted about 700 synoptic weather reports. So the earlier information is confirmed. The weather station was officially operated by the German Kriegsmarine Navy. The station itself consisted of about 5 dugouts and a log bunker in which 7 rooms were located: an equipment room, a bedroom, a dining room, a kitchen, and storage rooms. For living quarters, the log bunker was buried in the ground, and for greater disguise, the upper part of the structure was painted with white paint. In addition to the network of minefields surrounding the station, several firing points were built at the same time. It was impossible to view the structure of the station from the sea. Despite the harsh polar conditions, the life of those Nazis was put on a fairly high level. The German diet included Portuguese sardines, beef, and canned vegetables. Meteorologists drank beer, wine, coffee, and tea. The only problem was that with the canning nature of the products. So their work did not stop the Nazis from seizing the moment for small everyday entertainment. The Germans willingly took pictures, skiing, arranging real ski slopes, and of course they hunted. The prey was the seal and polar bear. Of course, the Germans did not shun the meat of the beasts they shot because they sought to diversify the diet. This ultimately led to the closure of the station. The collapse of the station came suddenly from the side that was not thought of by the military planners. In June of 1944, all the members of the station's crew came down with the signs of an infectious disease. The Germans suffered from severe headache, diarrhea, insomnia, pain in the muscles of the back, abdominals, and buttocks. Meteorologists and the military vomited, which eventually led to dehydration. The situation was constantly getting worse. Finally, the station's senior officer and its immediate supervisor, Marcus, sent a message to Berlin about the critical situation of the crew. Germany quickly and soberly assessed the situation. A Focke-Wulf 200 Condor transport plane with a doctor on board immediately flew to the station. It turned out that the entire staff of the station fell ill with an extremely dangerous and severe form of trichinosis, which would inevitably lead to death without timely treatment. The fact is that all polar stations, polar meat there was consumed almost on an ongoing basis. Studies have shown that meat of 90% of bears is infected with parasites. In order to protect this meat for eating, it takes a long, up to 3 to 4 hours heat treatment. Only after long cooking is the bear meat suitable for eating. Naturally, German meteorologists knew about this fact because the fatal bear, so to say, for the station's crew was far from being the first one. Thus, most likely the German hunters simply removed their prey early from the fire. Landing the aircraft was extremely unsuccessful. Focke-Wulf stuck in the sand and damaged the chassis. While the doctor examined the station's crew, the pilots sent a message about the impossibility of raising the aircraft into the air. Soon, another aircraft flew from Svalbard with a load of parts required to repair the chassis, which were thrown off from the air in the vicinity of the base. Within half a day, the entire station crew and pilots pulled the plane out of this dirt trap and then repaired the landing gear. When the work was finished, the Germans left Alexandra Land forever. True, there was still an attempt to return. A new batch of meteorologists to the island was supposed to deliver a submarine. However, to be delivered by a submarine, I take it. However, due to the extremely difficult ice situation, the submarine did not reach its cherished goal. Now this territory of the Kladoiskatel, or treasure hunter in Russian, as that's the Russian name, that station is being actively explored by the employees of the Russian Arctic National Park. Like I said, despite the physical liquidation of the station, there are many historical artifacts of that wartime. Items of uniform, instruments for meteorological observations, books with the seal of the Library of the German Navy, music books, magazines, containers for wine and fuel, cartridges and casings, and so on are becoming the trophy of the Russian researchers. New information about Nazi activities in the Arctic began to appear. And so much time has gone since the end of the war. Let's look at some additional information. On September 12, 1951, the Soviet research icebreaker Semyon Dezhnev came across the remains of a German military base near Alexandra Land at Cape Nimrod. There was a weather station with radio mast, warehouses, utility and residential buildings. The researchers found inside stocks of canned food, clothing, various documents, in particular related to the operation of the radio and weather station. It turned out that during the war years, the secret Nazi base number 24, Kriegsmarine, operated on the island. 5 kilometers away, another base was discovered where, according to the documents found, the Schatzgraber weather station was located from 1943 to 1944. We already know which island. In the late 1950s, during the construction of the airfield on the peninsula of Polar Pilots, ventilation shafts and the entrance to the grotto located under a rock were found. However, it was difficult to get inside because of the tides. This area kept going underwater. When this information was made public, rumors spread that Nazi submarines were based in the grotto during the war. There is anecdotal evidence that in September of 1944, the commander of the Soviet minesweeper T-116, Lieutenant Commander Balabanov, visited this cave. How he got there is not entirely clear. There is an account that the officer was given special task to search for the secret Nazi bases. Anyway, Babanov said that a stone staircase led down inside the grotto. At the back of the cave, there were two piers with equipment to which serviceable electrical cables were connected. The description given by Babanov fully corresponded to the information provided in his memoirs by that German Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Nevertheless, the lieutenant commander did not make any official report on his find. Everything is known only from the words of his acquaintances with whom he shared the information. Or was this information simply classified? So, we already know that Russian researchers learned about the enemy station only in 1947, having seen it from the air. We know that in 1951, the first Soviet expedition that came to Alexandra's Land even lived in this wooden house, and then a weather station was placed in it. Later, a real settlement for Arctic explorers was built to the side of it, and the station was burned down. Apparently, again, it was destroyed as evidence of the Germans' presence. Russian explorers managed to find hundreds of items belonging to the station's personnel, including as yet unexplored books and records. That's what we know from the open sources. As for the island today, well, Russia in 2017 unveiled its newest military base in the North Pole, complete with 18 months of sustainable reserves for the 150 soldiers who are manning it. The base is reportedly capable of housing both the MiG-31 fighter jet to defend against possible bombing strikes, as well as the Su-34 frontline bomber, which is capable of carrying a variety of Russian-made tactical nuclear weapons. It should be kept in mind that the construction of the Arctic Army has not yet been completed in Russia. The process of formation and deployment of formations, rearmament, etc. continues. Current plans of this kind are planned for several years ahead and provide for a new increase in combat capability. However, today it is possible to judge the creation of a powerful mobile fist capable of reliably protecting the interests of the country in the region from terrestrial, and I would say extraterrestrial adversaries. Russian soldiers have been training in the region in order to become familiar with the terrain, weather, and their military capabilities in the event they are ever attacked. The base is located in Alexandra's Land, the Russian island at the top of the earth, so to say. The base is built in the shape of a three-pointed star and consists of numerous special-purpose structures, as well as control centers, garage, warehouses, and an autonomous power unit. Its hulls are painted in the color of the Russian flag. To date, it is the only building of this scale in the world, built at 80 degrees north latitude. Arkhangelsk Trelistnik, or the Arctic Shamrock, is located on the island of Alexandra's Land in the Franz Josef Land archipelago, and is the second military facility built in the Arctic to deploy air defense units of the powerful Russian Northern Fleet. The first was the Northern Clover military base on Kotelny Island in the Novosibirsk Island archipelago. The construction of the facility has been underway since 2007, but it was not until 2015 that information about the Arctic Shamrock became available to the press. In the total area of this complex is 14,000 square meters. The Soviet Union people have mastered the North for a long time and thoroughly. Since 1921, there was a base in the Arctic. Since 1936, a polar station. Since the 1950s, stations of the Soviet Hydrometeorological Service and a bunch of military units of the 10th Separate Air Defense Army. And in the 1990s, they abandoned everything. Now they have just returned, although so far and much reduced compared to what it was numbers. Although, in fact, yes, almost everything has to be mastered anew. There may be many reasons: a foothold in the Arctic, a real-time autonomous facility in aggressive natural conditions, real-world testing of military materials and equipment for low temperatures, etc. This etc. certainly includes facing the UFOs and USOs that have frequented the Russian Arctic. I'm one of the few experts on this planet when it comes to UFOs and USOs of the Russian Arctic. Read Russia's USO secrets and see my videos about the Arctic, and understand that other nations are itching to get in, those that border the Arctic and those like China that have no borders there, because there's something that's going on there. And you can find more about it in my videos. And I think the Germans had other plans for that island, and in particular on Arctic in general, because they also knew something that you and I do not know. But to the extent possible, I'll continue my research. And if you like my research and you can support it, please do so through the links you'll find in the description to this video. Please like my videos. Please subscribe to my channel. Make sure they notify you of new videos. And thank you for your attention to my work.